We're very lucky to have the author of The Distraction Addiction, Alex Soojung Kim Pong. Alex, would you join us on the stage, please? Warm welcome, everyone. Warm welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's not Prince, but still it's a piece of music that I really like. Anyway, thank you all for coming out and being here so relatively early. What I want to do this morning is a way of starting off a conversation about the ways that technologies in sometimes unexpected ways insinuate themselves into our daily lives and affect us, is to have all of you do something really simple that you've probably already done several times today, but I'm going to ask you to do it a little bit more mindfully, which is, those of you who already have your smartphones out or your laptops, great. The rest of you, presumably they're somewhere close. You couldn't possibly go anywhere without them. So what I want you to do is to pull them out and check your email. While you're doing this, I'll give you a few seconds for things to load up and the network to try and accommodate the sudden surge of traffic. While we're doing this, I want you to take notice of something. While you're waiting for the mail to load, are you holding your breath? Because it turns out Linda Stone, who was a researcher at Microsoft, noticed that a significant number of people actually hold their breath while they're waiting for pages to refresh or mail to load. This is something that she calls email apnea. And it is a small thing, but given how many times you look at that screen and you wait for the mail, it's over 100 times a day can actually take on a little significance, because what happens when you hold your breath and you're waiting for you're waiting for your mail? Carbon dioxide builds up in your blood. This triggers, or begins to trigger, a fight or flight reflex, and consequently maybe makes you respond a little less generously, shall we say, to the passive-aggressive message that's come in about something that is due 3 weeks from now. Now, nobody designed email to have this effect on us, but it's a nice example of the ways in which humans seek to make technologies part of ourselves. And this is both a terrific thing, but it's also one that sometimes gets us into trouble. And I think we've all had the experience of using technologies or creating them in order to help us be more focused or more productive, but also having those same technologies be ones that can be sources of great diversion and great distraction. A book that I wrote called The Distraction Addiction, I explained why it is that this happens, the deep history of our relationships with technologies, and what it is that's special about the devices that we now carry around with us and interact with on a constant basis, and how it is that we can learn to use these technologies more mindfully, so be more mindful about them, so that we can be more mindful while using them. And even, it turns out, very busy people are able to discover ways of redesigning their relationships with their devices, redesigning their days to give themselves more focused time, to reduce distractions, and to help them be more creative and to get more done. So what I want to do today is to give a kind of high-level view of why this happens, to dive into a couple illustrations of things that people do in order to kind of recover their attention, to restore balance between themselves and their devices, and then to think a tiny bit about the bigger implications. So let's first say a little bit about attention and how it works. Now, when I talk about distraction, and I think we all understand fundamentally what this is, right? You're supposed to be focused on a particular thing, but instead, your attention gets diverted to something else, either because the thing you're supposed to be focused on is kind of dull, or because increasingly there is some other shiny, blinky object designed to capture your attention. Now, in some cases, these are technologies that are not necessarily designed to distract us, but do a very good job of doing so, right? Just as the designers of email did not create it in order to generate email apnea, they did not design it as a way of delivering or of intermittent rewards that stimulate the pleasure centers of our brains, but we do a very good job of turning them into sort of technologies that serve that purpose. In other cases, though, companies have learned how to use behavioral economics or neuroscience or insights and sort of design tactics from sort of video games to capture and often commodify our attention. So one simple but fairly powerful example is the use of defaults. If any of you are familiar with Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler's book Nudge, you know that defaults can be a very powerful way of influencing behavior. Well, this is a screenshot from Netflix, Breaking Bad, and you'll notice that one of the things that happens is that it automatically queues up for a television series the next episode. The default now is to keep watching. And I have not been able to verify, but I've heard that Netflix has played around with the number of seconds before the next episode starts to give users enough time to rationalize watching just one more. Because if it starts automatically, that's like, oh, I don't, no, I got to do this other thing. But if you have enough time to think, all right, I'll just get up extra early and I'll finish that report, or before I drive into work, it's more effective. And this is just one of many, many examples that we encounter through our days of technologies that in often fairly subtle kinds of ways hook into our curiosity, sociability, in order to get us to do things that they want us to do. Now, there are some people who have argued that this is simply an example of how our million-year-old primate brains are ill-suited for today's high-tech environment. But I think that that's actually quite wrong. As humans actually are fantastically well-designed to use technologies. In fact, we have never lived in a world without technologies of one kind or another. Whether it's stone tools from 1.5 million years ago. This one, incidentally, this hand axe is still sharp. I cut myself on it after taking this picture. I don't know any object that I own that I can imagine still being useful after 1 million years, but that one still is. Whether it's stone tools, whether it's iPhones, humans have spent the last almost 2 million years now co-evolving with technologies. Now, our hands are much more flexible than our primate cousins, in part so that we can make and wield tools much more effectively. Not only do we use them to enhance our physical capabilities or extend our physical power, but our brains also do a fantastically good job of adapting themselves to think of technologies that we use really well, that we use very commonly, not just as objects in the external environment, but rather as extensions of our own bodies, as part of what psychologists call our body schema. And so, what's going on when we confront technologies that are designed that end up distracting us is not that this is not a set of interactions or relationships that is inherently dehumanizing. We've evolved to use these really, really well. Using technologies is part of what makes us human. And so when we run up against these problems, I think it is worth asking whether it is a programming flaw, or whether it reveals a gap in our million-plus-year-old inheritance of using technology so well that they become extensions of ourselves, that they become extensions of our minds, or maybe it's that these things are actually pretty poorly designed. So, what can we do about this? what I want to focus on this morning is how, as users, we can begin to become a little bit more aware of how devices act on us so that we can then act back on them. Now, one of the first things to recognize is there's a critical difference between in attention when we're dealing with complicated tasks and when we're multitasking. So with complicated tasks up on top, you're dealing with multiple things simultaneously, but they all converge on a single goal. Multitasking, in contrast, is doing stuff in parallel, different kinds of activities that do not that all have separate endpoints. A really good example of kind of complexity is playing music. Experienced musicians, expert musicians, are engaged in a fantastically complicated cognitive ballet when they perform. Because not only are they having to remember notes, where their hands go on the keyboard or the fretboard, lyrics, melody, harmony, they also have to pay attention to their fellow musicians, or maybe remember how they played through a particularly difficult passage in the past. They're also paying attention to the audience, getting a sense of taking the audience's temperature, getting a sense of how interested they are, what kinds of things they'll really respond to. All of this stuff is happening simultaneously. All of these different channels are processing information. But a good musician doesn't experience this as a cognitive overload. It's really actually very exhilarating. And in fact, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the great Hungarian-American psychologist and the person who has most extensively studied flow experiences, notes that most examples of flow that we encounter in our daily lives are ones that we encounter when using technologies masterfully, whether this is riding motorcycles or playing musical instruments or working in a wood shop, building, beautifully crafting a table. The ability to use technologies really well is a terrific source of great pleasure. Multitasking, on the other hand, is a little different. And I'm going to illustrate this by engaging all of you in a very, very simple three-stage experiment. What I want to do is, this involves seeing how long it takes you to do three simple things. The first is reciting the first 10 letters of the alphabet, A to J. When I say go, I want you to recite them as quickly as you can. I will time you, then we'll move on. Everybody's clear? All right, 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, so that was between about 1.5 and 1.8 seconds, which is about as long as it normally takes people to do that. Next, let's do the first 10 numbers, 1 through 10, all right? Same rules, on go, 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, that was about 1.5 seconds once again. So, 2 tasks, each take about 1.5 seconds. Now, let's see what happens when we multitask them. All right, so go A1, B2, etc., up to J10. All right, everybody's clear on this? Let's maybe take a second to think it through. All right, 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. I think someone might have made it at about 10 seconds, but you'll notice a couple things. And one of them is that it's a lot harder to do that in the presence of other people, right? Because once they, even if other people are doing it right, if you're not reciting at the same time as they are, then it becomes a little problematic. If they start messing up, it makes it a lot harder for you. The other thing, though, is that these are 2 things that you have literally been able to do since you were about 2 years old, right? This is as close to an automatic cognitive activity as you can come up with. And yet, when you put them together, it turns out that there is this huge cognitive tax that you pay. And it's the same tax that you pay when you try to text and drive, which I'm sure none of you ever do. Or when you are trying to work on one thing and you get interrupted by something else, and then someone comes into the office and sort of has some third thing. So recognizing now that these are really two very different kinds of states with two very different levels of efficiency and productivity is the first step, I think, toward dealing with the problem. Now, one of the ways to begin to work through this is to make use of software that is designed to help minimize distractions, either like this minimalist word processor OhmWriter, which strips out unnecessary features and tries to essentially be as close to writing on a piece of paper as you can possibly get, though a piece of paper that has a really lovely little background to it. Now, another thing, though, requires a little bit more proactivity, because as I think everybody, anybody who has loaded an app, a social app onto their smartphones recognizes, those apps are social in the way that very small children are, the way that 4-year-olds are. By which I mean, like the amplifiers in Spinal Tap, the sociability is set to 11, right? They want to notify you about everything. In much the same way, actually, that when children are interested in, when children want to share something with you, they need to share it absolutely right now. That it is a tragedy if you don't pay attention to them, you don't respond. They do so without much regard for context, without really a sense of whether you're concentrating on something else that you think is going to be more important than knowing that your shoes are sparkly. For those of us who've had children, this is, I think we all know, or we've all had that kind of experience. And one of the things that as parents you do is help children understand when it's okay to interrupt people, who it's okay to interrupt, and under what circumstances. And we can do the same thing with distracting devices. I've been talking to people who senior engineers in Silicon Valley, where I live, and one of the interesting things I found is that there's an almost perfect correlation between how much experience or how senior someone is and how few people are allowed to call them. It turns out that I think of this as like they have a sort of zombie apocalypse white list. Who is it who during the zombie apocalypse do you want to hear from? And you make what these people do is you make a list consisting of generally immediate family, a couple colleagues, kids' school. You assign that an incredibly distinctive ringtone. For me, it's the opening bars of Derek and the Dominoes' Layla, because even though I've heard it a million times, no matter where I am, it's going to catch my attention. Everybody else, in contrast, gets, in my case, Brian Eno, because that does two things. Number one, it distinguishes the people who really matter to me from the people who don't. And second, it makes it a lot easier with the second to make a quick decision about whether I'm working on something and can be interrupted or not. Another valuable practice is to have some contemplative practice, whether it is regular Buddhist meditation or Jesuit examen, or a more weekly digital Sabbath in which you unplug from the things that distract you most. The value of this is it serves to remind you of what kind of how you're, what paying attention feels like. And much like going to the gym, it helps you when you're facing those situations where you have an awful lot of stuff coming at you. Now, it's also valuable to have periods of time when your mind is able to simply wander. You don't have to focus on anything at all. And this turns out to be really valuable for two reasons. And the first is that we think of mind wandering and focus as opposites, which they are. And we've often thought of them as adversaries, which it turns out they are not. Because what scientists are beginning to recognize is that people who have a great capacity to kind of sort of take their hands off the cognitive steering wheel and let their minds wander, the better able they are to do that, the better people are at focusing when they need to. We don't exactly understand why this is, but it's pretty consistent. The other reason that mind wandering turns out to be valuable is that this is the period when your mind never actually stops working. As you wander, as you let your mind wander, continues to work through things, to think about problems, sort of without without conscious effort. And it's often in those moments that you have the kind of aha insights that are the foundations of really good new ideas. So I'm going to wrap up and sort of leave with sort of one final idea, which is that there is a great Buddhist saying that pain is inevitable, but suffering is a choice. This is one that you hear echoed in many religions. And the basic idea there is that there are bad things that happen to us, that happen in the world, that we cannot control. What we can control, though, is how we react to them, whether we can be prepared, whether we can be resilient, whether we can learn from them. And likewise, those of us who work in technology are faced with a situation in which sort of connection likewise is inevitable. Or the idea of recovering our attention by turning these technologies off is one that is fundamentally unworkable. But it is possible by recognizing more clearly how our attention works, by thinking through what kinds of interactions we have or of relationships with technologies serve to be distracting, and then moving toward or redesigning those relationships. We can go from a state of continuous partial attention to one in which our devices don't serve always to distract us, but to help us be focused and more mindful. In other words, for those working in these kinds of industries, connection is inevitable, but it turns out distraction is a choice. Thank you. Hey, thank you.
And is there a mic out here? I just want to say that I'm really pleased because I know Alex for 25 years. I'm pleased to be here with him. His whole message about distraction is really, really important. And it's influenced me to take up a form of meditation that I call Jewish Buddhism, or Jubu for short. This has helped me immensely. And I keep accumulating more insights from this. I want to ask how many of you do feel you wrestle with distraction, and how many of you might even take prescription drugs for concentration. I teach at a university. Thank you very much for volunteering that bravely. You're not, you can't be the only person here. So, but it's just good because I think the message that Alex has is really, really important. Our lives have become overwhelmed rather quickly by digital devices, and mostly we've been forced as isolated beings to grapple with this, and the whole effort to enhance our consciousness and concentration through biomedical and digital devices too run counter to the distraction problem. They attempt to counter it. But I was just wondering how many of you felt that you had some kind of distraction addiction, that you couldn't put away your phones, or you can't go anywhere without your laptop. I don't know why I brought my little laptop out here.
Phantom cell phone syndrome. So, which is the phenomenon of you think your phone's ringing, it's in a pocket, but it's somewhere else. And this is, I think, something like 3/4 of people experience this on some kind of semi-regular basis, depending on how you measure it. It's also the case that, and it's a nice illustration of how attuned we become to what these devices are doing. Very much, I think, in the same way that you know, in a room full of crying babies, young parents can always pick out their own child, right? Now, the other thing with phantom cell phone syndrome is that, first of all, it's something that people who are less powerful tend to experience more than people who are more powerful. So in a hospital, for example, residents have it really badly, whereas senior attending physicians much less so. Because if you miss a call and you're a fourth-year resident, all hell breaks loose, right? The second thing is that, like so many of these issues, it is entirely correctable, right? One of the, and I know people who have gotten into the habit of keeping the phone near but not on them. And they report after a few weeks, it goes away. You know, the phone is still close enough so that so that you don't miss a call that you want. But you know, that the kind of creeping sense of it, you know, being somewhere, maybe doing something, begins to dissipate. And that's true for so many of these, you know, many of these problems.
I've got the opposite problem, though, Alex. I don't get enough emails. and I have a practice of sending myself many emails, often to remind myself of things, but sometimes I just want to tell myself something. And then I get the ping on my phone, and I have an email, and of course I'm very excited. But it's an email from me. It's my own email to myself, and that is very distracting, by the way, to be interrupted by an email from myself. So, you know, my iPhone is on Gmail, so I may be on my little laptop, send myself a Gmail, and then my phone interrupts me and I see I've got an email. Very excited, because I am lonely a lot. And I think that older people who are not being distracted by their digital devices are lonely and get these emails. But more about the distraction problem. I mean, I think that people really do get both tethered to these devices, dependent on them psychologically. And do you feel you don't concentrate as well as a result? And do you feel you need the kind of therapy that Alex is promoting? And I think he has a singular message that's really important. I'm not sure, anybody have any thoughts about that they want to share? Yes.
My question is more on a organizational or even a political level. Mm-hmm. You know, I think I read we see about 10,000 brands a day, I think is the estimate.
10,000 what a day?
Brands.
Okay.
So we see like a lot of advertising brands. What do we do either in our own lives or in the workplace to maybe organize? For instance, I work in cubicles. Are cubicles really a good way to kind of get away from distraction? Or what's like a good way to convince our work to change how we work to be less distracted and balance our lives better? Yeah,
and there are plenty of things that we can do as individuals. However, it is very much the case that there are often huge organizational and social pressures that push us toward these kinds of behaviors. Now, I think one of the things that are worth pointing out is actually there are a bunch of studies now that have tried to measure the cost of email. A couple of years ago, some Atlantic Media calculated that every message cost roughly $1 in terms of time spent reading it, time spent writing it, as well as, and basically for even a relatively small organization, they could have owned a Learjet for the cost of lost productivity to messaging. Another thing I think that organizations also are discovering is measuring the degree to which unnecessary communication ends up making organizations less rather than more productive. There was, I believe, Deloitte did a study of a big organization that had this practice of these weekly senior meetings that turned out to eat up an enormous amount of subordinates' time, shipping PowerPoints back and forth, making little tweaks, et cetera, and that there was something like dozens of years of person productivity that got soaked up by this stuff.
I won't participate Google Docs or shared docs. And people get very upset, mostly younger people and the bureaucrats.
There is another great stuff.
They say, you won't participate in our shared doc.
The other, you know,
I don't want to.
The other thing,
I'm meditating.
good for you.
Yeah.
Waiting for more messages from yourself.
Yes, waiting for more emails.
Which in a sense is what meditation is.
Yes.
So,
an email
but,
from yourself.
you know, the
Yes,
other thing,
very good.
you know, it is also the case that there are industries where, you know, we assume that if we don't write back to people instantaneously, that the world is going to spin off its axis and crash into the sun. There's a great book called Sleeping with Your Cell Phone that talks about the experience at Boston, a division of Boston Consulting Group. You know, total alpha, you know, gotta call the client back sort of this second types had, where they took a day a week and just went offline, or an evening a week. And the assumption first was that this was going to be the death of the company. 6 months later, they go to the clients, and after having found that retention rates went up, stress rates among employees went down, the fact that you knew you had an evening off was just a phenomenal gain for these people. And they asked the clients, you know, they were just kind of touching base with them about how the relationships were going. None of the clients noticed. None of the clients realized that the servers were getting shut down at 6 p.m. And this is, you know, this was, you know, so one of the, you know, in a way, one of the reasons that that organizations or some of our bosses feel the need to spend immense amounts of time checking this is it's a way of reassuring them that they're really important, that our work really matters.
So so you've told us a lot about fighting back.
Yeah.
Does anybody have an experience or a question about how you fight back? What battles you pick? Does anybody? Yeah.
I have a question up here.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm interested in the competing communication technologies. This year we all have to have Slack. We still have Gmail. We still have Facebook's Google Chat. What has your work discovered about those competing technologies? And I'm sure there's more to come.
Good question. I mean, I think that there is, we tend to organizations particularly tend to layer things on top, or you know, layer new channels on top of old channels. And I think that what the research suggests is that we have this weird kind of toggling between thinking of communication channels as something that's that everyone in an organization has to be part of, and yet they're also highly personal. And so the tendency is that for sometimes good reasons, sometimes bad, we end up having to construct these really elaborate mental maps of, you know, who will respond by email, who do you have to text, you know, who never ever answers their phone, and you end up having this kind of ethnographic sensibility as opposed to a policy sensibility of you know, who you can talk, you know, who is reachable via what means. Now, I don't think there really is, and no one has figured out how to solve this. And I think that it's, you know, I think it's the challenge is to figure out how to accommodate it rather than to impose. You know, everyone is going to be on blank, and we're never going to use this, you know, or this other thing again.
So you're kind of moving from digital distraction to a kind of digital prison, basically. No, I mean we've become imprisoned by these devices as well as distracted by them, and it's hard to find the right balance. Other questions? Yeah, I think what you're saying about organizations' regimentation is really a good point.
You know, the other thing that illustrates is that actually, communication between humans is an incredibly complex thing,
Yeah.
and it seems to be impossible to come up with one system that works for everybody. You can make everybody work to a system, but you know, but you think even of something as simple as calendaring, right? How do you get, you know, easily scheduling meetings between half a dozen people? Company's been working on this for like 30 years, and we still can't figure out how to, you know, how to make it simple. Sorry, question.
Yeah.
So the last tech company I ran, it was clear that we did have a digital prison, and so I put in place a vacation policy that said, we're not going to call you. And if we have to call you because you're the only one that has the launch codes, shame on you and shame on us.
Very good.
And
Good idea.
you may get emails, but we're not expecting you to answer any of your emails, to look at your emails. And it was amazing the change it made in the productivity of the employees. They started cross-training because they realized that it was in their interest to for other people to know what they did, and it created it reduced the amount of tension in the workplace pretty dramatically.
This is fantastic. I mean, I think there were, we have a small but growing number of examples of companies that have recognized that, that it's actually not good for people to be always on in the way that we are always on, right? And so many of us really actually like what we do under good circumstances. And that kind of constant mental engagement is not a bad thing. That doesn't mean, however, that always having to check your mail when you're on vacation is likewise a good thing. So I think this is, and there have been plenty of studies that have illustrated the declining returns of overwork. Essentially, for a few weeks of crunch time, or of longer hours mean more code. But after maybe about 4 weeks or so, the number of errors you introduce becomes so great that you end up having to hire more people to fix those things. This is true. I mean, this is true whether you're writing software or whether you're making physical objects.
Let's take another
yeah.
question over
Sorry.
here.
Hi, do you have any practical advice for how to deal with the fear of missing out that is really at the heart of constant checking of our devices?
The fear of missing out.
Well, I think my friends, I suppose, some of my friends or don't live such interesting lives that I'm afraid of missing out on anything that they're doing. Others are doing such fantastically interesting things all the time that that no matter when I check, they're off in Australia, kite surfing or doing whatever. I don't know. So, but more seriously, I think that this is, this is an electronic version of a classic social problem that we have, right? Which is that as social animals, we tend to measure ourselves against other humans and what other people are doing, and and this is accelerated by the fact that you can kind of hit refresh and there's a chance that you'll see new things that that people are up to. But I think that I would say that missing out on other people's lives is clearly something you don't want to do with your friends. Missing out on what they're doing this morning, maybe not, or maybe that's okay. So, but maybe that's just me.
One thing I wrote a review of Alex's book when it came out, Distraction Addiction. I asked, must this be an individual responsibility? Can there be a collective response to this? Because most of our urgent problems, we have collective responses to.
Yes.
Must we just push this on atomized individuals?
Right.
And at the time, I thought you didn't have a good answer, but now you have 2 years to think about it. And
well,
do you have a better answer now?
Well, the other thing is, socially, is that we are seeing institutions that are starting to work toward this. So schools, for example, there are some schools, for example, that now have policies where no email between students and faculty after a certain time, and also that students themselves instituting these policies. The way to keep from missing out is to know that other people aren't online as well.
The New York Times did an interesting story that the children of the wealthiest, most successful people in Silicon Valley are not letting their children the parents are not letting the children use computers anymore until they're like teenagers. I mean, this is very interesting when the people designing these machines and devices are not letting their kids use them because they're concerned. So I think there's a lot of growing concern here. I want to thank Alex for a wonderful presentation, and I hope you'll ruminate on this. This is really what's the shadow, the haunt that we feel is what could these devices be doing to us at a deeper level. And Alex has a new book coming out called
Rest.
Rest. He's giving away the title, so you have 6 months to write a book called Rest. It's coming out in December, and you now could be able to beat his book out. And there's no copyright on title, so thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
It's Rest.